quickly becoming the number one segment on the Run Home with Joel and Fletch. So from Channel 9, we're talking about the ultimate sacrifice.
Yes.
And we're just getting to the concluding stage, which means we need a new potty. And I'm pleased to say, to share that with us, heading towards episode number 5, Channel 9 reporter Ben Avery, who just happens to have been 20 years as a journalist with Channel 9. He's followed the story of Just Married for the past decade. Police are currently, investigating the case, is what I'm understanding. They're not. Oh, they're not?
Not investigating.
Well, let's find out. Benny Avery standing by about this big case from Brunei. Hello, Benny. How are you, mate?
Good afternoon, guys. Thanks for having me. Yes, no, the police aren't investigating at the moment. There have been many investigations in the past, but currently I think we could describe it as a bit of a dead end.
All right. So, Benny, because I'm not familiar with the story, can you give us the bullet points about this, please?
Yeah, and most people won't be familiar with it because there hasn't been a lot of coverage of this case over the years. So it dates back to 1994. The victim was a South Australian school teacher named Anthea Bradshaw. She got in 26 years old. She got married on April 16 of that year, 1994. And shortly after that, her husband, Jeff Hall, got a job in Brunei in Southeast Asia. He was a radiographer. And he was working at a sports medicine centre there, and as part of his contract, he also was able to stay in accommodation that was owned by the Brunei royal family, which also owned that sports medicine centre. So he put up an accommodation that was nearby. Anthea's plan was to go and stay with him permanently. She's going to try and get a job at a school there to work as a school teacher. But first she needed to wrap up her existing teaching contract, which was in South Australia. And so she was finishing that. The school holidays come along and she decides that she'll go and visit Jeff during those school holidays. And she goes over to be there for 10 days, but sadly 9 days in, her family back home here in Adelaide get a phone call from Jeff, and he tells them, and he's dead. And he's been murdered in his apartment. And that's where this mystery begins. And what this podcast is looking at is not only, what the family were hearing from back here, but what the people in Brunei heard and saw as well.
So, were they married at the time or engaged or?
They'd been married for 96 days, it was. So, married on April 16, and the murder happened on July 21 of that year.
Chatting with Channel 9 reporter Ben Avery. As I said, 20 years as a journalist. We've had the story around Ultimate Sacrifice. They're really good podcasts. And to not know the story, which I quite like this. I like going to a movie, Brian.
Yeah.
And I'll be digesting all of this, but I love going to a movie without seeing the trailer. I love not knowing the story. And as Ben said, most Australians will not know the story, but how heavy and how in-depth the story is, it's remarkable, isn't it?
So, Benny, how did you come across... Okay, sorry. A bit of technical difficulties. It's insane that no one had heard of this story before.
Yeah, massive story.
Oh, we're back on air. Hey, Benny, can I ask you this, mate? What made you so interested in this particular story? Because I suppose it is fascinating, but as you said, not many of us are familiar with it.
So he was a member of the Bradshaw family. Anthea's brother, Craig, contacted me about 10 years ago, it was now. It was a phone call to the Channel 9 newsroom in Adelaide, and he filled me in on this case, and I was very surprised there hadn't been any coverage, and any coverage that there was had happened many years earlier. And so it got me looking into the case, and as it turned out, there was actually a little bit of progress in that last 10-year period. The Australian Federal Police would ultimately conduct an investigation after being given jurisdiction to do so, but that investigation ultimately didn't go anywhere, and they in fact called it a case evaluation and not an investigation, which essentially means that it was never really properly investigated into the full level that it could have been. And so essentially that's where we are today. The family felt like they were at a roadblock. And so this podcast goes over some of the key evidence to perhaps see how the AFP came to its decision not to investigate further, and also perhaps what opportunities there might be in the future.
Hey, chatting with Ben Avery of Channel 9. Now, Benny, in the past, no matter how many podcasts you go back when it comes to true crime, the very first podcast I ever heard of, and I didn't even know what a podcast was Serial. Adnan Syed, in that case, when they dropped the podcast, a lot of leads came through. We've heard the same of Who the Hell is Hamish? We've heard the same of The Teacher's Pet, Ultimate Sacrifice. You're heading into episode 5 of this particular one, Just Married, of course. Have you had any leads? Have you had any unusual conversations that have hit your desk?
Yes. So, firstly, there have been some interesting witnesses come forward from Brunei, including a woman who lived next door to the apartment where this happened. She says that she'd become friends with Jeffrey Hall very quickly, and that for some reason he was very concerned about listening devices in his apartment, and she's never been able to work out why. I found that unusual. Further to that, we speak to a lot of Anthea and Jeff's friends, and some of them have raised concerns about some things that perhaps were going on in their relationship in the lead up to them going to Brunei. I've tried to contact Jeff Hall to put some of these concerns to him, and he hasn't responded. So there have been interesting things from Brunei. There have been interesting comments from Anthea's friends and even one of Jeff's friends. And then we've also spoken to South Australian police who investigated this case at one point because they felt that Brunei wasn't investigating it properly. And they talk about some of the evidence that they brought back from Brunei, which included the shirt that Jeff Hall was wearing on the day of the murder, and that shirt was found to be stained with what appeared to be human blood. And then there were various reports done into the blood patterns on the shirt to try and work out whether or not that blood perhaps had got on his shirt when he says he discovered Anthea's body on the day of the murder, or whether it perhaps happened in some other way. And the podcast looks very closely at that. And I guess while I'm on that topic, speaking very specifically about the husband, I do need to point out that there has been an investigation by Brunei Police, SA Police, and the Australian Federal Police, and he has never been charged, and he has always maintained his innocence, and he does have alibi witnesses who place him at work at the time that the Brunei police thought that perhaps this murder happened.
Is there any
a real mystery?
Right. Is there any other suspects in Brunei that you know of?
So probably only other suspect that's ever been put on the record was an unknown man that was seen outside of the apartment complex shortly before when police believe the murder may have happened. And I've spoken to a witness the only witness who saw that man standing there, and she's described him. She says he had a cap pulled down over his head, and she was a bit confused as to why he was just standing there outside of the apartment complex. And multiple police reports have mentioned the presence of that man. However, no one has ever been able to identify him. So these are things that we try to get to the bottom of in the podcast, and certainly we're putting a call out to people listening to the podcast and this program as well. Anyone who may know more, certainly keen for them to come forward. And that might sound like a strange plea here in Australia, given that this happened in Brunei, but I can say that in that apartment complex was a big group of expats. These were people that lived, that had come from other countries, the UK, Singapore and Australia. So there were a lot of Australians working at that medical centre at the time, and I have even spoken to some of them. And so really, whilst this happened overseas, there is the potential for people here in Australia to perhaps know more about what happened to Anthea.
Chatting to Benny Avery of Channel 9, talking about the podcast about Anthea Bradshaw, Just Married. Now, Benny, after this one, I just love listening to this stuff. I cannot keep up with enough of this stuff. Do you have plans to go and chase down other stories that are podcasts? And it's a new way, in many ways, which the world's heading.
I have found it a rewarding process for sure. However, with this one, I think it was the case that came first. I wasn't sort of sitting there scratching my head going, I should do a podcast. What can I do it on? It was the family that approached me, and podcasting I felt was the best medium. So I think that's why this story is being told quite well in this format, is because it was case first and not sort of, as I say, trying to scratch my head as to what I could do. So I guess in the short term, my focus really is that. I'm actually still working on finalising episode 5 today. And then there'll be another 3 episodes at least after that, and we're hoping that some more information will come forward, and we'll do some more episodes after that as well. So really, that's my focus at the moment.
Ben, just getting back to Anthea and Jeff, was there any, I suppose, arguments or issues between the marriage before he went over to Brunei, before Jeff went over to Brunei?
So when I first started researching the podcast, I wasn't aware of any, and then I started to speak to some of Anthea's friends, and so I had a couple of friends come in to Channel 9 to be interviewed for the podcast, and one of those friends arrived with a letter that Anthea had sent her around 2 years before the murder, and in that letter Anthea was telling her about her relationship with Jeff, and she mentioned that they'd been having doozy of arguments, was how she described it, and that those arguments involved furniture throwing and minor injuries. So that was the first indication I had that perhaps not everything was perfect in that relationship. And there would be another friend that I would speak to who said that she had also noticed that Jeff and Anthea had been having some arguments. And so it did appear to me that this was a relationship that perhaps at times was volatile. And as I say, that was something that I didn't know going into the project.
And Brunei, is it a dangerous place? I know
No,
the Sultan of Brunei. That's about it. That's all I know about Brunei. Why do we get a lot of expats going over there? What for?
So the Brunei royal family owned this sports medicine centre, and it was really they like playing polo, and they like playing polo with their VIP friends from around the world. And so this facility was specifically for them and their friends. And because they had so many people coming from around the world, a lot of them English speaking, they were keen to have expats come over who could speak English, and treat them and their friends. So it was really largely expats who worked at that centre. And to answer your question about how safe it was in Brunei, I haven't been able to get rock solid figures on this, but there was one article done by News Corp that said that in the decade preceding Anthea's murder, there had only been 3 other murders in that 10-year period. So not many at all.
Oh, wow.
And that's because it was a very strict country. Murder was punishable by the death penalty, and still is, not often enforced, but it still is. And not only that, a lot of people that were there at the time tell me not only were murders unheard of or almost unheard of, thefts, break-ins, and minor crimes like that were extremely rare, and they hadn't seen much evidence of it at all. The only stats I've got were from the United Nations that sort of paint a similar picture. There might be an average of about 3 murders a year from about 96 onwards. Still, it's not a lot. It's not. So it was, as I say, to answer your question, it is seen as a safe place.
Brian, the signing of our first Defence Memorandum of Understanding in 1985, Australia and Brunei have undertaken numerous bilateral military exercises, policy dialogue, training and capacity building exchanges. Foreigners make up 18% of the Brunei population. 1 in 5 thereabouts is a foreigner.
So, okay, Benny, if legalities around the murder taking place in Brunei, they'd have to be sent back there to be trialled? Extradited, that's the word I'm looking for, Sugar, nice word. Or can you, I know you mentioned the Federal Police were looking into it here, can we charge any suspects that are involved that live in Australia now?
That's a great question, because it's very important to this case specifically. So initially it would have had to have been the Brunei Police, but the Bradshaw family fought to change the law here in Australia a few years ago. It happened in 2015. They passed a bill with the help of a couple of politicians, one Nick Xenophon and the other Christopher Pyne, who was a senior cabinet minister at the time. They passed a bill that basically meant that the Australian Federal Police could investigate an overseas murder if it involved an Australian, if the victim was an Australian. And so that essentially gave them a level of jurisdiction where Jeff Hall or any suspect in the case, and he is the only suspect that has been named, as I said earlier, if they had found that there was enough evidence, which they didn't, but if they had, then the case could potentially have happened here in Australia.
Oh.
As I say, they haven't got to that point.
Hey, Ben, I'm sure it's shared in the podcast, and we'll keep talking about that. Just Married, of course, Channel 9 bringing you that. But what was the main alibi to excuse Jeff?
There was a sighting of Anthea alive at around 1:50 in the afternoon, and there was the sound of a dispute between a man and a woman heard at that apartment complex at about 2:15, which gave rise to a theory that perhaps this murder had happened at 2:15 in the afternoon.
Mm.
Jeff Hall says that Anthea dropped him at work at midday that day and that she was to pick him up for a dinner break at 5 p.m. And he was seen in the medical centre working with his colleagues, including at and around 2:15 that day. And he then went and stood outside of the sports medicine centre at 5, waiting for Anthea to pick him up. Lots of people saw him there, and Anthea never arrived. So Jeff's story is that he was at work when the murder happened.
Mm.
And as I say, a lot of his colleagues give him alibis and say, yes, we saw him there.
Wow.
The South Australian police have since looked at whether or not Anthea was still alive at 1:50. So they've probed that sighting of her. And they've also questioned whether that domestic dispute was even linked to the murder. So they basically have investigated, is it possible that Anthea was murdered before Jeff went to work? And they've also obviously had to probe those alibis further to say, okay, lots of people are saying that they saw Jeff at work, but when was it? And was there the opportunity for Jeff to duck home? Because the apartment complex was only about a kilometre away as the crow flies. But it is important for me to put on the record that there was a theory that it happened at 2:15, and there were probably at least 5 witnesses who placed Jeff at work at that time of the day.
Benny, I know I've only got about a minute or so to go. What was the cause of death? What did the coroner say the cause of the death was?
Yeah, and that's when it gets really interesting as well, because the coroner found that Anthea was manually strangled, which means someone used their hands to strangle her to death. And then the stab wounds that were in her abdomen area were inflicted after death. Oh. So 4 or 5 stab wounds when she was already dead. And no one has ever been able to explain why the killer first strangled her to death and then decided to stab her lifeless body.
Ben Avery, Channel 9, mate, we'll be keeping close to this one, and we froth on this stuff, as Brian would say. We froth all these true crime podcasts. The podcast, which is absolutely flying, heading up to episode 5. Just Married, the Anthea Bradshaw mystery. You can listen on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Any information you can just send through to Benny and the team. Just Married Podcast at protonmail.com. That's Just Married Podcast at protonmail.com. Ben Avery, thanks so much for joining the Run Home with Joel and Fletch.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Benny.
There he is.
Fascinating story.
Fascinating. It is very fascinating and well told by Ben Avery as well. The Anthea Bradshaw mystery, Just Married. As I said, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, Brian.
Yeah, I've got to go to a quick break. On the other side, we might discuss that a little bit more. I've got a few questions to you, Joel.
Okay, I'm not sure I've got the answers,
no,
Brian,
I know,
but I'll
you're
try.
a good reader.
Okay.
You make me comfort.
Good.
You bring me comfort.
I'll make you comfort.
You bring me comfort.
Okay.
You're like a big doona.
Okay, let's go, Doona boy. Breaking back with more.